As the mind continues to return to pleasurable experiences through memory, a subtle but powerful pattern begins to form. Repetition. What was once a single moment becomes something the mind wants to experience again and again. Not because the moment itself demanded repetition, but because thought has captured it, stored it, and now seeks to recreate it. This is where dependency begins. At first, the repetition may seem harmless. The mind remembers something enjoyable and naturally moves toward it again. But over time, something changes. The experience is no longer just enjoyed when it happens. It becomes expected, anticipated, needed. The mind begins to rely on certain experiences to maintain a particular state, a certain feeling, a certain sense of satisfaction. Without it, something feels incomplete. This is the beginning of psychological dependence, not necessarily on the object itself, but on the feeling associated with it. And because that feeling is tied to memory, the mind begins to chase it, to recreate it, to hold on to it. But each repetition is slightly different. The original experience cannot be perfectly reproduced. And this creates a subtle dissatisfaction, a sense that something is missing, even while pursuing the same thing. So the mind intensifies its effort. It seeks more, stronger, more frequent, more refined versions of the same pleasure. And in doing so, it strengthens the dependency. The experience becomes more important, more central, more necessary. And with that importance comes fragility. Because what is depended upon can be lost, can change, can stop providing the same feeling. And when that happens, discomfort appears, restlessness, irritation, emptiness. This reveals something fundamental. The repetition of pleasure does not sustain satisfaction. It creates dependence. And with dependence comes vulnerability. Because the mind is no longer free. It is tied to something, conditioned by it, shaped by it, and constantly seeking to maintain it. But when this entire movement is observed clearly, something begins to shift. The mind starts to see that what it is chasing is not the present experience. It is the memory of it, an image, a reconstruction. And that realization creates space. The next time pleasure arises, it can be seen as it is. A moment. Complete. Not something to be extended. Not something to be repeated. Not something to be held. And in that seeing, the pattern begins to weaken. Not through resistance, but through understanding. Because the mind is no longer unconsciously repeating. It is aware. And in that awareness, the cycle of dependency begins to loosen. Naturally. Without force. Without suppression. Simply because it is no longer being sustained in the same way.
When the movement of seeking pleasure begins to quiet, something very subtle yet profound starts to change in the way experience is lived. At first, the mind may interpret this as a loss of excitement, a loss of motivation, a loss of something that once gave life a sense of color or intensity. Because for so long, pleasure was not just experienced, it was pursued. It gave direction, it created goals, it filled time. Without that movement, there can be a brief sense of emptiness, as if something is missing. But when attention remains with this space without rushing to fill it, something begins to reveal itself. Nothing essential is gone. Only the constant movement towards something has quieted, and in that quieting, a different quality of experience begins to emerge. Pleasure can still arise, but it is no longer chased, no longer extended through thought, no longer turned into something to be repeated. It appears, it is felt fully, and it ends, without leaving behind a psychological trace that demands continuation. This changes everything because the mind is no longer dependent on pleasure to feel complete. It is no longer organizing itself around what feels good. It is no longer moving from one experience to another in search of satisfaction. There is a stability that does not come from maintaining a feeling, it comes from not needing to. In this stability, something unexpected begins to open. Sensitivity. A deeper perception of life that is not driven by seeking. Small things are noticed. Subtle changes are felt. Moments are experienced more fully, not because they are intense, but because they are not being overshadowed by desire. There is a quiet richness, not based on accumulation, but on direct contact, without interference. This does not make life dull. It makes it clear. Because experience is no longer filtered through the need for pleasure. It is not evaluated in terms of gain or loss. It is simply lived as it is. And in that, something becomes evident. Pleasure was never the problem, nor was it the solution. It was simply a part of experience. What created conflict was the movement of seeking it, of holding it, of depending on it. Now, without that movement, pleasure finds its natural place. It comes and goes, like everything else, without controlling the mind, without defining the moment, and without leaving behind a trace that must be followed. And in that, something very quiet becomes clear. Freedom is not the absence of pleasure. It is the absence of the need for it. And in that absence, life reveals a depth that cannot be pursued, only lived. Now. After the movement of desire has been seen, attention naturally turns towards something even more subtle. Pleasure itself. Not as a problem, but as something the mind relates to in a very specific way. Pleasure begins simply a moment of experience, a sensation, a response in the body that feels good. There is nothing complicated in this. It is direct, immediate, complete in itself. But almost instantly, something else begins to happen. Thought notices the pleasure. It registers it, and then it returns to it. not physically, but psychologically. It remembers, it replays, it recreates the experience internally. A moment that has ended is brought back as an image, and that image carries the memory of the sensation. In this way, pleasure is no longer just something that happened. It becomes something that continues. In thought, the mind begins to dwell on it, to revisit it, to strengthen it. And through that repetition, the experience is extended. But this extension is no longer the original pleasure. It is the memory of pleasure. And yet, the mind treats it as if it were still alive. This is where something subtle begins to take place. Pleasure becomes psychological. It is no longer just an event. It becomes part of the mind's ongoing activity. The mind begins to build around it, to form associations, to create importance. That was meaningful. That was special. I want that again. And in doing so, pleasure becomes linked to identity, to memory, to time. This creates a shift. The moment of pleasure is no longer complete. It is now part of a larger movement, a movement of continuation, of repetition, of seeking. And within that movement, something else begins to appear. Dependency. The mind begins to rely on certain experiences to recreate that feeling. It looks for them, it anticipates them. It organizes itself around them. But what is being sought is not the original experience, it is the remembered version of it, which can never be exactly the same. And so the cycle continues. The mind seeks, finds, experiences, remembers, and seeks again. This is how pleasure, which is natural in itself, becomes something more complex. Not because of the sensation, but because of what thought does with it. And when this is seen clearly, something begins to shift. The focus is no longer on pleasure itself, but on the movement of the mind around it, how it holds it, extends it, recreates it. And in that observation, the entire structure begins to reveal itself, not as something to change, but as something to understand as it happens.